Hi, so I'm here with Mike VanElzakker to discuss the new NIH study, which has caused a lot of sturm and drang over the last week, I'd say. Um, so, Mike, why don't you just sort of give us your overall impressions of what you found? And one thing that I did think was interesting was the contrast between, media coverage, which was generally respectful, I think, in terms of positioning as sort of evidence of there's a real illness here, as opposed to, again, not that psychological or psychiatric issues are not at all real, but the idea being that the study asserts pretty declaratively that there are immune dysfunctions and other factors that are causing these things. And yet it's really been, the patient community has been really distraught for some, I think, clear reasons. So why don't we talk about that? Why don't you give me what your impressions are?
Yeah, so I get, a lot of impressions. It was a study that went on for a long time. I guess, one thing that really jumped out to me right off the bat was that, something like 1 out of 5 of the people that they had enrolled throughout their detailed workup that they did, to their credit, I think, they found kind of something else that was wrong that caused them to be labeled with the MECFS label, but then they found out, some other medical problem. And, from my perspective, I suspect that that's really true across the board in a lot of cases, maddeningly, and it's really difficult. Where essentially this study performed the function of what a primary care physician used to do, which is to do a really deep dive, essentially across different forms of specialization, and try to understand, why is this patient sick? What's happening to them? And
Right.
20%, yeah,
Most people get diagnosed with ME or CFS or ME/CFS without deep phenotyping of everything.
yeah, right. So there's the MECFS label kind of as it should be, and then there's the MECFS label as it is in our current medical system, kind of in the real world. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people are given this label without having that sort of deep. It's difficult, lots of testing, but that was one of the things that stuck out to me right off the bat, is that their sort of filtering process caught a lot of people, and I hope those people were able to find some good treatments and that sort of thing. But I suspect that out there, that's a big problem.
Do you think that's related to the lack of clarity that we have about clinical about case definitions for the illness?
I'm sure that doesn't help, but part of the issue is that a lot of the sort of core symptoms are, what we call non-specific symptoms. The core symptom of lack of exertion tolerance, or a difficulty recovering, or an exacerbation of symptoms after exertion, it seems to be somewhat specific, although that needs to be looked at more carefully. But a lot of the symptoms are sort of general symptoms of a lot of different illnesses. So from my perspective, a lot of them kind of look like innate immune system activation, which is going to be true across lots of conditions. So it's just a significant problem.
So let's talk. What were your impressions then about what they found and what they didn't find, or what they found and then how, and then again, this really this emphasis on what they were calling, quote, effort preference, which I think really causes a lot of concern for patients, understandably, in terms of framing it that way. But what did you? Well, yeah. So why don't you give us your take on all that?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, when I first read it, the thing that popped out to me the most was the immune. First of all, a lot of what they did, I think, was to look at things that other groups had done, but now just in a given individual, which is, a lot of what my lab and my collaborative webs are also trying to do, is sort of more deep, instead of just getting a group of patients and looking at one thing, looking at a bunch of things kind of together. But they had, reported evidence of antigenic stimulation in the immune system, which to me was the take-home message that I wish people were amplifying. So they said, let me just read the quote. So the immune system profiling results were that, quote, may suggest the possibility of persistent antigenic stimulation, and that, quote, one possibility is that these changes are related to antigen persistence of the infectious pathogen. Now, to me, that's a huge lead, that I would like to see patient advocacy groups and patients demanding a follow-up for that.
Hmm.
Like what's my antigen? What are the antigens? What is it that's driving these immune system responses? That to me is a really fundamental question. Is it the same in everybody?
The framing there is somewhat tenuous. It's like there may be a possibility of this being. It doesn't sound. I mean, and I think there. Again, I'm not. I can't really assess this myself very well, but there seem to be some questions. I think at least on like the science for me form about whether there really was evidence and sufficient evidence produced of antigenic stimulation. So it does seem to be an open question.
Consistent with, I think, would be the way that you would frame it, is it consistent with antigenic stimulation? But those are questions that can be answered. They found evidence of activated T cells. We have techniques now, kind of further at the cutting edge that are more expensive and difficult, where you can do T cell sequencing. You can work backwards if you have isolated T cells and figure out to what is the T cell responding.
Hmm.
So that is the kind of follow-up that if I were in this study, I would be demanding, okay, if my T cells are activated, which they were across the cases versus controls, not in every individual,
Hmm.
what is my T cell responding to? Is it really a pathogenic antigen or what? That's the thing that I would want to be finding out.
Hmm. Okay. So that's one thing. And other things that you saw in the data that were of interest to you along those lines on the possibly positive side or the possibly side of telling us something that we didn't already, kind of know.
Yeah, I'm not even sure that that tells us something we didn't already know, but it's sort of like another bit of evidence that this might be happening. And the paper I was a little bit I mean, there were more authors than there were study participants, right? I mean, it was
Was everything in the kitchen sink on top of it too?
yeah, and it was sort of not being nitpicky, but it was sort of written that way where it seemed like it was a bunch of different authors kind of telling different perspectives, and so that part of the story is the part that I would sort of focus in on and want to amplify and would want media to pick up. And if I were talking about it to friends and doctors, that's the part that I would focus on.
Hmm.
It seemed to me that they were trying to at least gesture towards saying, okay, this is not a condition of lack of effort, or this is, these patients really were, showing peak effort with their exercise testing and that sort of thing. So it seemed like they were kind of gesturing towards trying to defend patients in that way. But then there was the part about sort of effort preference that I mean, I understand why patients are frustrated, just like, okay, another dive into this. Now, to me, I while completely understanding the frustration, I totally get it. I would not be focusing on that when talking about it publicly. I would be focusing on the antigen part. So focusing on that part to me is a little bit like launching a political campaign by saying, despite what my opponent says, I am not a philandering sociopath. Don't frame it like that. Frame it the way you want the framing. Okay, there's evidence of this ongoing antigenic stimulation. What is the antigen? What's happening here? Can we do biopsies? Can we do T cell sequencing? Let's figure out the actual cause of what's happening to these folks' immune system.
So it's interesting because I have somewhat of a split view of myself in that way, since I'm sort of as well as I have a public health degree, but I also been a journalist for a long time. So I sort of also, to me, it's important, how do things play? How do things play in the media? And the PACE trial played hard out in all the ways that we hated, because it sort of seemed to confirm what they wanted it to confirm. And here we do again have media reports saying, basically taking it seriously in a different way. And so I look at that as a positive from the study, even if it's not really the study itself. It's not a critique of the study, good or bad. It's sort of looking at the way it's been portrayed by media, and the average person reading about this in science or in whatever publication in general is going to get the idea that, I think, ME/CFS, as we're calling this cluster of illnesses, is a serious thing that people really are having, and not, is psychological or psychiatric. Seems to be the message coming from the main media things. Do you get that same?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say I've read more than a couple of articles, but that was the sense that I got from the articles that I read, that people were talking about it in that way, that there was sort of like, there wasn't some silver bullet, as I personally don't think there's ever going to be a silver bullet, a
Mhm.
single pathway or a single protein or a single channel, but that there was sort of evidence of all these problems, and, maybe follow-up deserves to be had. So that was the sense that I got just from my limited exposure.
Well, I mean, the other thing is that also, and sort of from the other perspective, as you sort of suggested, I think the problem with the language of effort preference and the way that was all described, and sort of they use the word discomfort. People want to avoid discomfort instead of that. They're rationally trying to avoid an extreme crash. I think the language was really so, in a way, off, and that it does give room for those who have certain other agendas to sort of run with that in some sort of way. And I think I can certainly agree with the patient's critique of that use of that language. Um, what did you think of the whole idea that this was centrally mediated, and that they seem to discount the idea of any peripheral fatigue or sort of fatigue, muscle these are the kinds of things that have shown up in other studies about dysfunctions in the muscles themselves, as opposed to it being a centrally mediated phenomenon through impact on uh, neural stuff going on in the brain.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's ever going to be that simple to just say central versus peripheral. The way that the data looked was the way that data looks for most studies, which is noisy. You find a group difference, a group of patient data points versus a group of control data points that are overlapping. And in some cases, there are people at the way extreme, but most of the time they're overlapping and just show group differences. So, I thought that was an interpretation. To me, if and one of the peer reviewers did sort of push back about that effort preference sort of like framing a little bit. I thought that they had focused a lot on kind of interpretation, where it was a little bit hard, I would imagine, for a non-scientist to tease apart what was an actual finding versus what was an interpretation.
Mhm.
If I were a peer reviewer, I probably would have asked them to split that a little more carefully, where things were reported as a result that were really kind of interpretations. So, the idea that like
Maybe there was just stuff about the activity going on in the brain in terms of what was causing, what was triggering what.
that was a thing that stuck out to me right away as a neuroscientist, where I kind of like cringed a little bit when I read the right temporal parietal junction has this job of like sorting out effort matching. I mean, yeah, I guess. I mean, it's got like 50 jobs.
Well,
You can't.
they seem to have a very clear idea of what they were saying it was doing and why it was acting up in one case and not in terms of control. Why there was a difference between the controls and the patients. And it did seem to me when I saw that section, I thought, well, they said it's due to this or due to that, I think was the language they used. And I thought, how do you know what's due
Yeah,
to what?
that was the section that I suppose I liked the least, that made me cringe a little bit, because I think if you were to get 100 neuroscientists together and ask them to name three brain regions involved in effort or movement or action, they would be saying motor cortex, premotor, striatum, basal ganglia, cerebellum. I don't think anybody would say temporal parietal junction.
Hmm.
So it may be, there's an Italian group that put out a theory. I wouldn't call it fringe, but it's not some well-established, this is what this brain region does, about the temporal parietal junction being involved in it. It's called association cortex. So essentially, it takes a lot of different types of information, processes, as information comes in, processes output. That might be motor output, but it's deeply involved in attention, for example. So, like, let's say that you're in a room right now where there's a clock ticking. And before we got on, you were noticing the clock ticking, right? And as soon as we started to talk, you started to focus on my words. Well, that would cause a deactivation of temporal parietal cortex and an activation in more top-down attention processes.
Mhm.
That would be another interpretation for a deactivation in temporal parietal junction. They saw a deactivation in superior parietal as well. So okay, but my point here, without getting in the weeds, is really that it was an interpretation. That they could have interpreted it in a couple different ways, and you have to do that in a study, in a paper. You have to try to tell a story. But I probably would have asked the authors to be a little bit more clear about what was interpretation and what was a direct finding. Even the idea of antigen stimulation, as you pointed out earlier, is an interpretation for the results.
Mhm. What how does this what they're finding square with sort of the things that you're looking at, or you've been looking at, or that you're more deeply involved in terms of your research?
Yeah, so I have to say I don't tend to do that kind of work that's really focused on sort of like preferences and that sort of thing. We tend, we do in our MECFS study, which we have a big MECFS neuroimaging study. This study made me feel better because it's really not easy to carefully recruit this patient population. Me and two CRCs are about at the same pace as this whole group of the NIH in terms of recruitment. It's really difficult.
Hmm.
But we're doing studies that are trying to understand the mechanisms of brain fog. Why is it that people have trouble concentrating and things like that?
Hmm.
In regards to neuroinflammation, we're doing some work in the same study related to neutrophil and platelet activation, for example. Again, with the idea that maybe there's ongoing stimulation of the immune system that may be leading to these downstream consequences. So
Hmm.
it's not really directly, we don't do anything about like effort preference or anything like that. I just don't have that in any of my studies.
Okay, so just I think we've covered some ground here that would be probably helpful for people. So just sort of stepping back for a minute, do you have any kind of advice in terms of I guess one thing I wanted to ask is that it seems to me to some degree that the significance of this paper, or the weight that this paper, because it's been 7 years, because it was so expensive, because it was much hyped, but then after, because they couldn't get the people because of the pandemic, because of all the things that they've sort of put this paper together in kind of not a complete, not their complete study as they intended it. It sort of seems to have taken on a significance sort of out of proportion, to some degree, to the findings, I guess, except the fact that it's a major statement from the NIH and people sort of take it that way. But just looking at what's there, it just seems like people, unfortunately, understandably, I want to say, expected a huge amount from it that it wasn't prepared or couldn't deliver.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't, I don't think I think it's a reasonable effort. It is a little bit frustrating to sort of focus on a few of these sort of more like, effort-based, choice-based measures, but they did do kind of a deep phenotyping, which I think is valuable. There is a type of a credibility with it coming from the NIH. Ironically, one of the criticisms that I hear a lot is that that relatively low N 17, which is true. But I almost take the opposite
Right, right.
tack, which I
That
think, yeah, I think that rather than expanding, um, what we should be doing is a really deep phenotyping of N equals 1. Every patient gets a deep phenotyping. And so that would be my dream if we were really focused on health and we were treating every patient as though they were a star basketball player or something. Like what would
Well,
we
that
do
would
if
be,
we
I mean, presumably the point of that would be to
right.
make not just deep phenotyping of whatever we think MECFS is, but to make sure that they're properly diagnosed and that we don't have 80% who are given this label, but may actually have something else going on that explains it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it was 20%, but yeah, the idea is that the goal is to figure out what is wrong with the person sitting in front of me. What is happening to that person? What are some things that we can do to try to mitigate those symptoms and to treat them? So that's what my dream would be, is that these sorts of studies would develop a sort of a panel of tests that we would be giving to each patient to try and understand what's wrong. I personally think
Like better differential diagnosis, essentially.
not just diagnosis. I want to get people better. What is happening to them that we can actually address and figure out, not just figuring out what this diagnostic label means. But, you know, that some of the things that they did, you know, T cell work, et cetera, B cell work, fine. Like I think that tissue biopsy, gut biopsy, T cell sequencing, to what are the T cells responding?
Hmm.
Those are answerable questions that you could figure out. So if a patient comes in and they are one of the people that have an elevated T cell, you know, cytotoxic T cell response, let's say, figure out what are their T cells responding to, and maybe we can address it. So to me, these sorts of studies are pointing to a series of tests that we might do, but even still, I would probably focus on, like, you know, tissue biopsies, understanding what the antigens are, things like that.
Okay, Michael, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, David, and hang in there. We'll talk soon.